"Is there any combat pilot on board?" The captain's voice carried through the narrow airplane cabin, steady but edged with urgency that everyone could hear. A ripple of uneasy silence spread across the rows of blue seats as passengers exchanged confused looks. The aircraft hummed thousands of feet above the clouds, sunlight pouring through the oval windows, but something about the captain's tone made the air feel heavier than usual. He stepped further down the aisle, scanning faces quickly, his uniform sharp and pressed, the silver stripes on his sleeve catching the cabin light. No one answered. People lowered their eyes, some pretending to check their phones, others simply frozen by the sudden responsibility that question carried. The captain repeated himself louder this time. "Is there any combat pilot on board?" The question lingered like a challenge no one wanted to accept. Then his gaze fell on a young woman slumped in seat 8A by the window. Her head rested gently against the side of the cabin wall, long light brown hair falling over her shoulder. She wore a simple white blouse and beige skirt, the kind of outfit that suggested a college student traveling home, or maybe heading to a quiet internship somewhere. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, eyes closed, completely still. At first glance, she looked like she was just sleeping through the flight, unaware of the tension spreading around her. The captain frowned slightly, leaning closer as if checking whether she was conscious. A few passengers watched with quiet curiosity. The man in the next row whispered to his wife, "Poor girl must be exhausted." No one imagined that the quiet student in row 8 could possibly have anything to do with the captain's urgent question. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The captain straightened again, running a hand through his hair in visible frustration. Something serious was happening, something the passengers didn't yet understand. The engines droned steadily, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from routine travel to uneasy anticipation. The captain spoke again, slower now. "If there is anyone with military aviation experience on this aircraft, I need you to come forward immediately." Still no one responded, except the young woman in seat 8A stirred slightly, as if the words had reached her through a distant dream. And the moment her eyes began to open, the entire direction of that flight was about to change. The cabin of Flight 271 had started the day like any other cross-country trip. Early morning sunlight spilled across the airport runway hours earlier as passengers boarded quietly with coffee cups and travel bags. Most of them had already settled into the familiar rhythm of flying. Seatbelts clicked, overhead bins closed, flight attendants moving down the aisle with polite smiles. Among those passengers was the young woman in row 8 by the window. Her name was Emily Carter, though no one on that plane knew it yet. To everyone else, she looked like any ordinary college student traveling alone. Her white blouse was neatly pressed but simple, the sleeves rolled casually to her elbows. Her beige skirt and small leather bag gave off the kind of understated style people rarely noticed. She had boarded quietly, offered a polite smile to the flight attendant, and taken her seat without drawing attention. A few rows behind her, a businessman had briefly glanced up from his phone and assumed she was probably a student heading home after exams. The truth was that Emily had learned long ago how easy it was for people to underestimate someone who stayed quiet. For most of the flight, she had simply watched the clouds drifting past the window. Her expression remained calm, almost distant. Occasionally she closed her eyes, not exactly sleeping, but resting in a way that suggested she was used to long hours of travel. Across the aisle, passengers chatted softly about work meetings and family vacations. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, until the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Hayes stepped into the aisle with the focused stride of someone carrying responsibility heavier than the passengers realized. He was in his early 40s, tall, composed, his uniform perfectly fitted. Years of experience had trained him to keep his emotions controlled, even when problems appeared in the cockpit. But the subtle tension in his jaw that morning hadn't gone unnoticed by the senior flight attendant. Something had gone wrong. Not a catastrophic failure, not yet, but something serious enough that the captain had made a decision he had never made before in 20 years of commercial flying. He needed help, real help, military-level help. When he first asked the question, "Is there any combat pilot on board?" the cabin responded with confusion rather than action. The passengers were ordinary people, teachers, travelers, parents, a couple heading to a wedding. None of them expected to hear that kind of request during a routine flight. The captain waited several seconds after asking the question, scanning each row. Silence. His frustration wasn't directed at the passengers. It was directed at the situation itself. Something about the aircraft's control systems had begun behaving unpredictably during cruise altitude. Nothing dangerous yet, but unstable enough that Hayes knew a second set of highly trained instincts could make a difference if the situation escalated. When his eyes landed on the young woman in row 8, he paused only because she hadn't reacted at all. Her eyes remained closed, head tilted slightly toward the window. She looked peaceful, almost completely disconnected from the tension spreading through the plane. Hayes leaned closer and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Miss?" he said quietly. Emily opened her eyes slowly. For a brief moment her gaze was unfocused, adjusting to the cabin lights. Then she looked directly at the captain standing beside her. His expression was serious, professional, but there was no panic in it, just urgency. Around them, passengers had started watching openly now. Conversations faded. The captain asked again, though his tone softened slightly when speaking directly to her. "I'm sorry to wake you. I just asked the cabin if there's a combat pilot on board." Emily blinked once, studying his face carefully. For a second, she looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was, a tired student caught in the middle of someone else's problem. The captain seemed ready to move on, assuming she would shake her head like everyone else had. But Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him toward the cockpit door at the front of the aircraft. Something about her expression changed, though it was subtle enough that most passengers didn't notice. Then she spoke quietly. "What kind of problem are you having, Captain?" Hayes paused. It wasn't the answer he expected. Her voice carried a calmness that didn't match the nervous curiosity of a typical passenger. "Flight control feedback," he said carefully. "Autopilot disengaged unexpectedly. We're maintaining altitude, but the response curves aren't behaving normally." Emily listened without interrupting. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the wing outside the window, as if calculating something silently. The businessman behind her leaned forward slightly, suddenly interested in the conversation unfolding just a few feet away. The captain waited another second, then said politely, "Thank you for your concern, but unless you have military aviation training, I should continue asking the cabin." Emily's gaze returned to him. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Actually," she said softly, "I might." And for the first time since stepping into the aisle, Captain Hayes looked genuinely surprised. The cabin fell into a deeper silence after Emily's quiet answer. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped. But the subtle shift in attention was unmistakable. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen were suddenly very interested in what would happen next. Captain Hayes studied the young woman in front of him more carefully now. Her posture had straightened slightly, her eyes fully awake and focused. Yet she still looked like the same quiet student in a white blouse and beige skirt that had boarded the plane hours earlier. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested combat aviation experience. Hayes spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You said you might?" Emily nodded once. "Yes, sir." The respect in her voice sounded natural, not rehearsed. Still, the captain hesitated. Aviation emergencies were not situations where guesses were acceptable. "Do you have military flight training?" he asked directly. Emily glanced briefly around the cabin. Dozens of strangers were watching the conversation now. She seemed almost reluctant to answer in front of all of them. "I do," she said. A man across the aisle whispered under his breath, "No way." Hayes noticed the reaction but ignored it. His focus remained entirely on Emily. "What aircraft?" he asked. She paused just long enough to show she was thinking carefully before answering. "Primarily F-18 systems, but also simulator training on multi-platform controls." That answer landed differently. The captain's expression changed from polite curiosity to serious attention. Even passengers who didn't understand aviation could hear the shift in tone. Hayes leaned slightly closer. "You're telling me you're a combat-trained pilot?" Emily gave a small shrug. "Technically, yes." The word technically made the captain narrow his eyes. "Technically?" She sighed softly, as if realizing she couldn't avoid explaining anymore. "I'm still finishing my certification hours for full deployment clearance. That's why I'm traveling." The explanation was simple, but it carried weight. Behind them, the businessman, who had earlier assumed she was just a college student, leaned back in his seat, visibly stunned. Hayes considered the situation quickly. In the cockpit, his co-pilot was managing the aircraft carefully. but the unpredictable response from the control system meant their margin for error was shrinking slowly. A second trained perspective could help. But inviting a passenger into a cockpit, even one claiming military training, was not something any captain took lightly. "Do you understand what I'm asking you to do?" Hayes said quietly. Emily met his eyes without hesitation. "Help you evaluate the control response." The confidence in her answer surprised him again. Not arrogance, just calm clarity. Hayes glanced once more toward the cockpit door, then back at Emily. "All right," he said. "I'd like you to take a look at something." A few passengers shifted nervously as the captain gestured toward the front of the plane. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt slowly and stood. In that moment, she didn't look fragile or sleepy anymore. The quiet composure in her movements carried a different kind of presence, one that didn't need attention but naturally held it anyway. As they walked up the aisle together, whispers followed them softly. "She's a pilot," someone murmured. "She looks like she's 20, another passenger said. Emily heard the comments but didn't react. The cockpit door opened, revealing the dim glow of instrument panels and the steady concentration of the CO pilot at the controls. Captain Hayes stepped inside first, then gestured for Emily to join him. The moment she entered the cockpit, the environment changed. For the first time on the flight, Emily looked completely at home. Her eyes moved quickly across the instrument displays, scanning altitude indicators, control inputs, and system alerts. The CO pilot glanced at her uncertainly. Hayes spoke calmly. "This is Emily. She has military aviation training." The CO pilot blinked in surprise but didn't question the decision. Emily stepped closer to the instrument panel, studying the data carefully. "When did the response change?" she asked. "About 12 minutes ago," the CO pilot replied. She nodded slowly, processing the information. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky stretched wide and calm, clouds drifting beneath the aircraft like white oceans. But inside that small space, something important had just shifted. Because the quiet student from row 8 was no longer just a passenger, and the captain was beginning to realize he might have found exactly the help he needed. The cockpit felt smaller than it had just minutes earlier, not because anything physically changed, but because the weight of responsibility inside it had grown heavier. Captain Hayes remained standing slightly behind the CO pilot while Emily leaned forward toward the instrument panel, studying the flight data with a calm intensity that didn't match the way she looked when she had been sleeping quietly in row 8. The glow from the navigation screens reflected in her eyes as she moved her gaze from one display to another. Airspeed indicators, altitude stability, control feedback signals. She didn't rush. Every movement felt deliberate. The CO pilot watched her carefully at first, unsure whether to trust a stranger analyzing their aircraft systems, but within seconds he noticed something that changed his perspective. Emily wasn't guessing. She was reading the information the same way trained pilots did, scanning patterns, identifying anomalies, mentally reconstructing what the aircraft was doing in the air around them. Captain Hayes folded his arms and asked calmly, "What do you see?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked another question. "When the autopilot disengaged, did the system give you a control feedback warning or a sensor fault alert?" The CO pilot nodded. "Brief feedback warning, then it cleared." Emily leaned slightly closer to the screen. "That's the problem," she said quietly. Hayes stepped forward. "Explain." Emily pointed gently toward the flight control response graph. "The aircraft thinks it's receiving a different pitch input than the one you're actually giving it. The system corrected itself for a moment, but the sensor isn't fully stabilizing." The CO pilot frowned. "You're saying the system thinks we're climbing when we're not?" Emily nodded. "Exactly. It's small right now, but if the sensor drifts further, the aircraft will begin compensating automatically." Hayes understood immediately, which could cause the control response to feel unpredictable. Emily looked at him and gave a small confirming nod. "Yes, sir." There was no drama in her voice, just clarity. The captain studied the instruments again, this time seeing what she had seen. "So the plane itself isn't failing," he said slowly. Emily shook her head. "No, the aircraft is fine. The sensor input just needs manual correction until it stabilizes again." The CO pilot exhaled quietly. For the first time since the issue began, the tension in his shoulders loosened slightly. Hayes crossed his arms thoughtfully. "And you're confident about that?" Emily met his eyes calmly. Yes. The captain paused, measuring her confidence carefully. Experience had taught him to respect calm thinking during uncertain moments. Emily wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply solving the problem in front of her. Hayes turned back toward the control panel. All right, let's correct it manually. For the next few minutes, the cockpit operated like a quiet, focused team. The CO pilot maintained steady control inputs while Hayes monitored system responses. Emily stood just behind them, occasionally pointing out small adjustments as the control feedback stabilized. Slowly, the flight response began to smooth out. The warning indicators that had been flickering earlier disappeared. The aircraft returned to a steady rhythm in the sky. The moment the final control curve flattened on the display, the CO pilot gave a small, relieved laugh. Well, he said quietly, that solved it. Hayes leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. Looks like it did. He turned toward Emily. For the first time since she entered the cockpit, his expression softened into something close to admiration. You handled that like someone who's been doing this for years. Emily smiled slightly, almost shy again now that the pressure had passed. I've had good teachers. Outside the cockpit, the passengers had no idea how close the aircraft had come to a difficult situation. They simply continued their quiet flight across the clouds, unaware that the calm young woman from row 8 had helped steady the plane carrying them all. Hayes studied Emily for another moment before speaking again. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I first saw you sleeping back there, I assumed you were just another student heading home. Emily chuckled softly. Most people do. The captain nodded once. Well, I'm glad I woke you up. She gave a small respectful nod in return. For a moment the cockpit was quiet again, filled only with the steady sound of the engines and the endless sky stretching ahead. Then Hayes stood and gestured toward the cabin. You should probably get back to your seat. Emily turned toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. As she walked down the aisle toward row 8, passengers looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect. They still didn't know the full story, but somehow they understood something important had just happened. Emily sat back down beside the window and looked out at the clouds again, just as she had earlier in the flight. Calm, quiet, almost invisible again. And maybe that was the lesson hidden inside the moment, because sometimes the person who changes everything is the one the world almost overlooks. Never underestimate quiet strength. It might be exactly what the world needs when the moment arrives.